Okay, let's shift and talk about gender. Don't worry, we're not going crazy, we're not going political, it's nothing like that. But there are gender barriers that you need to be aware of in the workplace that will help you to understand how and why other people are acting, and so that you can take action to foster the relationships between yourself and others. And when we go through these, you're going to see like, oh yeah, I know that, but it's just important to kind of call it out, and so that way we're able to recognize it more easily when it's happening and understand what our role is in a potential communication failure. So with men typically tend to interrupt far more frequently in a conversation and they're much more assertive and direct in their style of communication, right? We're talking about style before and cultural, same thing here. They're much more direct in their style of communication. And on that note, it might be because, men have been in business for so long in the United States specifically, that's why the United States kind of style of communication is a little bit more assertive and indirect, is because that's the way that men typically are. Like I said, far more willing to interrupt, far more willing to even self-promote, advocating for themselves and saying that, I have a good idea, or I'm really good for being in that position, and fighting for themselves to get promoted or be put into these additional positions of responsibility. And when it comes to conflict resolution, men tend to prefer to resolve their conflicts much more directly and perhaps even confrontationally, to call somebody out live in real time. Whereas, women use more cues versus a kind of direct language approach, especially in verbal, but especially in nonverbal communication. Women tend to focus on building a rapport and listening actively. And if you've been a part of this project at all and you've watched any of the previous videos, you'll know that that's what we promote here. We promote active, effective listening. And that's women, generalized, tend to focus on that, tend to participate in active listening because they actually want to understand, and they're not waiting for their turn to promote their ideas. And thus they're far less likely to interrupt than men are. And on that note, they're far less likely to self-promote. They would rather see the best idea put forward that will actually solve the problem, instead of just voting for their idea. Now, notice the use of tend to frequently here. I bring these up, but I do believe that most people know this through personal real-world experience, everything that we've been talking about. But everyone also has the experience of the opposite of this happening. When you've worked with people of the opposite gender frequently enough, you'll end up seeing that there is no gold standard, and there are many men who communicate in a much more subtle manner and who focus on building relationships and building rapport. I mean, I'm one of them. Look at this program. the whole premise of what we're doing is called connected leadership. That's the leadership style and approach that I created and developed. And it's very much on the female side of this spectrum of communication, if you will. And you have to bear in mind that there's also women out there who are much more direct than men and fierce in pushing themselves and their ideas through to the top. And I think that to a certain degree, not so much in the self-promotion side of things, but definitely in the direct style of communication, my wife is a great example of this. There's no way you're not going to know exactly what she's thinking or feeling. She's going to let you know when you're doing something that's messed up, and there's not going to be a moment's hesitation, which is a beautiful thing. Unfortunately, what we've seen for the Army, now you can earmuff for the children that might be listening around, but the problem that women tend to have, at least this is what I experienced, or what I observed women experiencing, and from talking to them in the military, this is what they say they experience, is if they're focusing on relationship building on the way up, then they get called a whore. And if they are looking out for themselves and direct and strict and by the book and hold people to the standard, then they're a bitch, right? And unfortunately that can be the case, but I think it's just a matter of those typically those reviews and those thoughts typically come from people in the combat arms side of the military, which, for those that aren't familiar, there's a bunch of part of the army that is not combat arms, right? So combat arms are people be like the infantry and combat engineers, MPs, things like that, that are much more combat facing. But there are a ton of other parts of the army that are different, like supply, logisticians, intelligence, even like the HR kind of management. Those are not combat arms. And the reason that there's a difference there isn't because the combat arms guys are hard and the other ones are soft. That's sure, there's a degree of that to some certain extent, but there's some bad support people out there. Anyway, the main difference is the frequency with which people work with the other gender. And so when, I came up in combat arms, I was in short range air defense, and I was actually in one of the last graduating classes that did not have females in the class. I think it was actually the class after us was the first class that Army had shifted their perspective on short range air defense to start allowing females into the positions. And so there was a couple of girls or women, young women, who were going through the school in the classes following us. And then some of those girls showed up to our unit later, and they worked with us. And so you could see the shift, especially with some of the guys that were more senior, that there's a little bit of a harder time for them to adjust and to understand the different types of communication styles and things of that nature, because they've spent their careers only working around guys and an occasional female here and there in those support roles. Because of that lack of familiarity, then when you see actions that are taken that some people might not perceive as standard or regular or generalized from their other experiences with women in a professional capacity, perhaps before or outside of the military, they get caught off guard and they're like, oh, well, obviously this is what you're doing. And it's naive. It's all of the things that you could say about it. It is that, but it's just an exposure thing. And as more women came in, especially from like the officer side and from the kind of senior leadership perspective and not from the bottom up, and more of that happens, there's more exposure and people become more familiarized with that. People come in different, stripes and with different perspectives and leadership styles and approaches. And it's just about who's effective. And so the good leaders start to recognize that very quickly. And so that is part of the game, unfortunately. But I think the important thing here is get into the mode of breaking this model of thinking in your head and really get to know your people individually. I mean, this is going to allow you to learn about your team in a real and enduring manner. And that's the only way. So if you get to know your people and how they operate and what drives them, what motivates them, what keeps them up at night, then you're going to understand why they're making those decisions. And as they progress and make themselves more valuable to the team and put themselves in positions where they can get promoted, and then they eventually get into the leadership positions, then you understand that. And that helps to promote more awareness, and it helps to, bridge the gaps of communication that are happening. And so you're